Good afternoon and welcome back to the Face of Steel here in the former Templeborough Steelworks in Rotherham. We're here today for Big Ideas Live, a new format for Sky News in which we take time to explore big issues and big ideas. If there is a big idea that the government would like us to be thinking about today, it is levelling up. But as Ian King pointed out in a session this morning, what it means in practice is still to become entirely clear. Some of my own family who live in Sheffield and who work in Nottingham as well, never tire of telling me that there's a vast, deafening, sucking sound common across the north. And they say that's the sound of power, money and jobs being sucked from the regions into London. Well, they love where they live and they think they have a better environment, better quality of life than in the overheated south. But every time something goes wrong, they tell me COVID, fuel shortages, the threat of inflation or indeed stagflation we're now talking about, they feel that they're going to be hit first and hit harder. Well, yesterday, the former Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Heseltine, speaking here on Sky News, offered his own big idea to me. And he said that the government needed to devolve power to accountable leaders, named, elected leaders in the regions because they know what's needed. So is that the answer? Or would that just mean more fragmentation of the nation? Can the identity and pride felt by many communities across the north of England help to drive economic growth? I'll be discussing that with a panel of experts in a moment. But first, our business correspondent, Helen-Anne Smith, is here to set the scene. Helen-Anne.
Thanks, Trevor, and afternoon again, everyone. So we've heard so much about levelling up over the last year or so, haven't we? Not just from those who propose it, but also from those who protest that they don't really know what it means. And historically, there's been a lot written and a lot said about the inequalities between North and South. But at this very moment that we're at now, post-pandemic, what are the challenges and the opportunities as well to getting this country well and truly levelled? So, first of all, where are we at? I want to address head-on that notion that the North routinely gets less spent on it than the South. Is that true? So take a look at this. Firstly, I want you to pay attention only to how high up the blobs are on this graph first. What we've charted along this axis here is the total spend per head in each region of the country by the government in 2020. So total, look, London up there at the top is the most. But look, the North East and the North West actually come in second and third. However, total spend doesn't really give us the whole picture because total spend includes things like NHS salaries and benefits and money that sort of is there and then it's gone. So what we've plotted along the axis at the bottom is total investment spend for each region of the country. Investment spend going into infrastructure and things like that. And as you can see, a slightly different story. Again, London out there at the far end. South East coming second. And although the North West not so bad, the North East, Yorkshire and the Humber much further over towards here. So a very different story. Now, crucially, this is just a moment in time. This is just 2020. And of course, what happens over time, incredibly important as well. So what we've charted here is the growth in investment spend since 2016. 2016, of course, you remember, just shortly after we very first heard about the Northern Powerhouse. Actually, you can see up in the top there, the green line, it's the West Midlands that has had its spend grow the most in terms of investment. That's likely a lot to do with HS2. But the South East coming in second there. And crucially, I just want to draw your attention to the yellow line at the bottom, Yorkshire and the Humber, where we currently are. Really one of the only regions in the country where spend really declined over that period, peaking just about to what it was in 2016, very, very recently there. Now, look, in terms of regional recovery and regional prosperity, it's not just what the government is doing that matters, but it's also what we as consumers are doing and how we're behaving. So what we've charted here is footfall recovery in cities around the country since the pandemic compared to pre-pandemic levels. For obvious reasons, we haven't been able to put every single one on there because it'd be a lot, but I've just picked out a few that I think tell interesting stories. stories. Firstly, the two at the top, Blackpool, Southend. It's worth saying there are only four cities and towns in the whole country where footfall is now recovered to what it was before the pandemic, or indeed exceeding it. They're all seaside and touristy towns. Down at the bottom there, London, Sheffield, that big story of city centres just really struggling to recover in terms of their footfall. And then in the orange, Barnsley. We've put that on there because there's a really interesting story around some of these sort of smaller regional residential towns. Actually, some that historically have been a little more deprived. Some of the footfall and the spend has recovered much, much better there than in other places. That's partly because of it's more residential, people live there, and also because a lot of the businesses in those places are more likely to be essential, so people need to get back there for their essential spend. It matters as well what business is doing, of course, the number of companies, the number of jobs, the amount of employment. What we've shown you here is the growth in the number of companies in each region of the country since 2010, so since that financial crisis. And look, it's really clear, isn't it? London, the southeast, the southwest, it is still those regions that have by far the biggest growth in the number of companies. And we know that there's well-documented problems with qualified people sometimes choosing to leave to travel south, particularly to the capital for work. And very finally, I want to leave you with this. This is incidentally my favourite chart of the day, and I think it gives a slightly quirky look into some of the problems we face. This shows the inequality of broadband connectivity in different countries across the world. So the red blobs, the least connected region in each country, the green blobs, the most connected region in each country. Essentially what this is showing us is that we have a greater inequality of connectivity in this country than Colombia has, certainly a greater inequality of connectivity than Denmark has. And look, our worst connected region, the northeast there, is by far worse off than the vast majority of all these other countries, the US, France, Spain. Worth saying the same picture plays out when you look at Germany, Italy, Portugal. So I hope this gives a bit of a sense of just how much there is to do and just how multifaceted the problems are if we really want to get this country well and truly levelled up. Thank you. Trevor.
Helen Ann, thank you very much indeed. Some striking grasp there. I'm mildly disturbed by the idea that it's easier to watch us in Colombia than it is in Gateshead right now. But let's we'll come to the son of Gateshead in a moment, because I'm joined by a group of experts who are going to discuss what the North needs from government and what indeed the North might do for itself today. Chris Green is the Conservative MP for Bolton West and Atherton. Simone Roche is the founder of Northern Power Women and Northern Power Futures. Charles Egbo is the Vice-Chancellor of Leeds Trinity University. And Sebastian Payne, the aforesaid son of Gateshead, is the author of Broken Heartlands, a journey through Labour's lost England, just out this week. Let's start by looking forward. Let's talk about opportunities. They say we should never let a crisis go to waste. Ed Conway this morning identified 4 crises that we're in the middle of: labour, distribution, materials, and so on. Simone, is there an opportunity for the North in this crisis?
I think we're always going to look at an opportunity. When we set out at the start of the pandemic is what can we do? And I think our focus has always been about what can we do. We know there's lots of barriers there. We know there's lots of inequality. We know there's lots of hurdles. But from the campaign and the movement that I created, which was about accelerating gender equality and social mobility from the North, it's very much looking about that we can approach. And so at the start of the pandemic, like, what can we do? What can we do? The first thing was to check in on people, was to check in how are we going to wrap an arm around these senior business leaders doing making these, history-making decisions every day, and also to check in on those at the start of their career who think, actually, what on earth is ahead of me? How on earth are we going to navigate what's ahead? So what we did when we set out at the start of this is we documented as we went along, and a year ago we created a levelling up report, but it was our levelling up by powering on, and very much about looking at the opportunities, as you say, Trevor, and the positive thing that came out, and looking at some of the good stuff that happened. And I think that's what we have to do at times, because there's certain things that we can't do, but actually what can we do? And I think there's a company, one of the reports recently is one of our Northern Powerman community, a company in Leeds, just not too far up the way, has had a 30% growth. It's a small pan intelligence software development company, but they have 30% growth, and they've done that because of the lack of geographical barriers and the lack and the impetus around flexible working, which we haven't had before.
Okay, Charles, you're in, if you like, the intellectual industry. Do you think that what we're seeing, as Simone's saying, is a situation in which there's a new opportunity created by, in a way, destruction of geography?
There will always be opportunities. I think the question is providing the appropriate and conducive environment to be able to harness those opportunities. If I give you an example from the Leeds City region, where I reside at the moment, we have 380,000 people, or 26% of the adult population, that have no qualifications or very low skills. There must be something in that resource pool which we could tap in. If you look at how the world is changing around us, and you look at what we need to do around the construction industry to help us with the issue of sustainability, especially in our homes, there's the suggestion that 70% of all the houses we need for the next 30 years have been built already. It's what do we do to convert and modernize them to make sure they are habitable and meet the energy use. So there's something to be done around that. There's something to be done around the transportation as part of supporting us in reaching the carbon neutrality. But I think we need to ask ourselves the question, in the policy we put forward, in the legislation and regulation, how do we create an environment for businesses, for the young people, give them the confidence to think about tomorrow and then the future? So there is opportunities, but we have to harness that very, very quietly and confidently.
Chris Green, well, we've heard two examples of opportunities. Can the North realise those opportunities on its own? Or does it need something from the wider nation and from government?
Well, the North is part of the United Kingdom, so it's got to be a joint effort. I'm looking forward to later this year for the government to produce its white paper on levelling up. We have a strong sense of what it ought to be. At least many commentators and people looking in have a strong sense of what it ought to be. And I think a key aspect is when we look at the City of London and the wider South East, what's one of its great qualities? Transport. If someone wants to locate a business in the South East of England, you know your pool of talent is immense. We need the North of England to have that pool of talent. And how do we get that pool of talent for any business wanting to locate here? It's by having a far better network communications, whether it's public transport or motorways and railways. We need to sort these things out. But the second point is focused on education. It needs to go hand in hand with transport infrastructure. There was a report from the Children's Commissioner about 3 years ago, Growing Up North, and it showed London, which in 2004 was way behind the North of England, now is way ahead of the North of England. We've got to have that focus in the North of England on education. If we get these things at the same time, the talent we create in the North will get jobs in the North, and we create our own prosperity, and actually we choose what businesses, what industries we want to champion.
But better transport and better education are desirable everywhere, aren't they? I mean, is there anything special about what one would do in the North? Well,
it's basic things. So on the one hand, we are talking a great deal at the moment with HS2. And you look at HS2, which is fundamentally about a road link to London. And it's very difficult.
A rail link to London.
Sorry, a rail link, yes, a rail link to London. And you look at people getting the railways between Manchester and Liverpool. It's very difficult. They're only 30, 35 miles apart. It's very difficult at the moment, and we need that Northern Power Rail, a proper vision for what that's going to be and when that's going to be delivered. So then businesses know this is the time to invest, and we really get motoring or on the track.
Sebastian Payne, you've been conducting or doing a tour of northern cities in your own rather exotic mode of transport you can tell us about. How are you seeing it? Do you think that we're in a situation where there could be a renaissance of the North? And if so, what would it look like?
Well, it's very interesting we're talking about this here because I'm sitting and you can see on a steel beam directly up there, it says Labour support strikes, vote Scargill. So I think that is a slogan from a slightly different political age in this building.
Probably not
here.
the place to start.
No.
The Renaissance.
But I think this is actually an example of how the North has changed in a way many people haven't quite recognised it, because when people have looked at many parts of the country that voted for Brexit and voted for Conservative for the first time in 2019, that's the era they think of. They think of an industrial era that's in decline, not places that have gone through a lot of change and a lot of renewal since deindustrialisation. And one of the places I visited in Broken Heartlands is Consett, again, a great steel town in the northeast of England that at its prime employed 6,000 steel workers. That closed in 1980. Unemployment hit 36% at its peak. And that went through a lot of pain, but if you look where it is now, it's got many new businesses, private housing, and crucially, a more diversified economic base. So in some ways, there's many things to be hopeful about, that these places are not stuck in the past, in my view. They're not looking backwards. They are optimistic about the future. But to come to some of the points that Chris was making, there is a long-term underinvestment, particularly on transport, particularly on infrastructure. So that's why I think it deserves particular focus from this government there. But I think it's not just about money, though. It is about structural reform. And this is when Lord Michael Heseltine is completely right on mayors and power, that you're not going to make these places better from Whitehall. It has to be done with good, strong local leaders. So if you look in South Yorkshire, you've had Dan Jarvis or Ben Houchin in the Tees Valley. They have brought and enacted change. So we need more mayors with more powers. We need to make up for that historic underinvestment in transport, and skills as well is completely crucial. In some ways, the solution is not that difficult to make the North better. The key thing is delivery and doing it and making it happen.
Just, I'm going to come to some comment I think we've got from the audience. But before I do that, Charles, this issue of skills. Ed Conway, in a blizzard of interesting charts today, one of the ones that was, I thought, most significant was that he showed that every country has a skills mismatch. That is to say, if you ask people, have you got the skills to do the job you're currently doing? In Germany, about 20% are essentially in the wrong job. In this country, it's more like 40%. Do you think that there is an issue with our capability of getting the right people to be able to do the right jobs, to essentially rebound from where we've been in the last 18 months, 2 years?
It's interesting, Trevor. The issue is both skills shortages and skills gap. I think the point you were making latterly was the skills gap.
Yes.
In other words, those who required particular sets of skills for the jobs they need, that quality of skill is not there. I have to say the issue have been going on well before Brexit, well before COVID. It's just got slightly worse. I remember many, many years ago when I was a student of construction, about 30 years ago, and I know you do have what is called direct labor supply, where a particular company trains up their own staff and not wait to get the staff from supply chains. But those eras are gone. I think it's a mixture of us having policies that are consistent and sustained. Okay. We've had the toing and froing, where the government at times it's finger pointed, asking you haven't invested, and the employer turn around to say, we can't invest because the environment is not conducive. So the issue becomes, we all need to know that this is joined up. The employer has a role to play. The government has a role to play. And I dare say the university, which I'm part of, has a role to play to make sure we look at skills for today and skills for tomorrow.
We're going to come back to this issue of coordination. But let me go to Hashim in our audience. Hashim, I think you had a comment on this issue.
Yeah, so I wanted to say it's been reported recently that the disparity in productivity and economic output per capita between parts of the north and the southeast is in relative terms as large as it was between East Germany and West Germany before reunification. It took decades and trillions to narrow that gap, so I think that demonstrates that levelling up must go beyond electoral cycles. It's not just about the amount of money that we spend, but importantly about where we spend it, and crucially it can't be achieved by central government alone. So I wanted to ask what can be done to create an environment which attracts more private sector investment, and what role does ambitious regional mayors, as you've mentioned, Sebastian, play in supporting that?
Well, actually, let's make that almost literally concrete. Take a case in point, which is transport. Andrew McPhillips, I think, has a question on exactly that issue. Andrew.
Yeah, thanks. New research published by Mott MacDonald today shows that Northern Powerhouse Rail could have a greater economic impact than the government's own figures even suggest. Does the panel agree that a new line linking the cities of the north, and which is also reliant on HS2 being delivered in full, is a project which, if cancelled, leaves levelling up as nothing more than a broken promise?
You were addressing this a moment ago, Chris. Do you agree that scrapping it would be a broken promise? And tie that, if you would, to Hashim's point about how we actually coordinate, how we bring this all together, rather than being a series of projects.
I think we ought to be cautious about bringing it together too much, because you have to leave that opportunity, a perspective from the private sector, to think these are the opportunities we have. I do think, to a significant extent, that the north of England, when you're looking at globalisation, when you're looking at other specialties in the United Kingdom, you look at the Golden Triangle, you look at the financial specialisation in London, you look at different parts of the country, I do believe that the north of England and manufacturing do go together very well. So the government has to set a vision that enables manufacturing. And you've got to have better transport, obviously. HS2 is often seen as a route down to London. And one of the disappointing facts was that Northern Power Rail was dependent upon HS2 being completed for the railway stations, whether it's in Leeds or in Manchester, to cut across. So we have to find out very quickly, I think, to give people confidence, what's going to happen with that eastern leg up to Leeds on HS2, and if that does go, that there is a railway station that's going to be put in place for Northern Power Rail, which needs to be get going very soon. So there's a huge...
What is Mr. Shapps, the Secretary of Transport, saying to you?
The Minister responsible for the Northern Powerhouse as well. So at the moment, I think they're looking forward to the publication of the Levelling Up White Paper. I think there's a lot of stuff to come from Michael Gove as well, who's just been appointed and responsible for devolution as well. So I think there's a great deal of work. And ultimately, the person we need to be focused on is the Chancellor at the Spending Review and the Budget later this month, where these announcements ought to be made.
So it all comes down to Rishi?
It does.
Simone.
I think collaboration is key. You talked about the roles that the mayors have to play, and I've seen there's clearly a connectivity between Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham. They will naturally play nice, but I've seen that cross-mayor collaboration and coming together, and there's been, just recently, only a couple of weeks ago, there's been the new Pandemic Institute that was launched in Liverpool, and that was done almost through a series of bringing together almost the impossible. How do you bring academia? How do you bring healthcare? How do you bring government? How do you bring global investor into a city to create jobs, to create this, you know? So I think there's examples there, but I think there's elements of we have to collaborate, we have to play nice. And I think when it comes to some of that, those big decisions as well, it's having the right people at the table. We've talked about skills. We've talked about skills all day. Where are those decisions that are being made about those, whether it be young people, whether it be sort of people underrepresented communities, need to be at the table when we're actually allocating or making these decisions as well is key.
Before we leave the topic of rail, I don't want, the soft southern, I don't want anybody to leave this thinking that the north is just a place where everybody is exactly the same. I suspect that there are people who think that there are imbalances here. Alison Matthews, I think, has a point on this in relation to transport. Alison. I think we're going to get a microphone to you, and it's with you now.
Hey, yeah. So I was just seeing that the North isn't Manchester and Liverpool. If you kind of guess by my accent, I'm not far from concert. Woohoo! And I feel like Durham and Newcastle really get forgotten about. And it's not just when it comes to transport, it's a lot of things. When you talk about the North, when government talk about the North, it tends to be Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, and the North East really does get forgotten about. Are we going to get included in things?
Seb, I talked to your king, the King of the North, Andy Burnham, 10 days ago, and he wants transport links and so on. And he was quite cross at the suggestion that what he's putting forward would benefit central Manchester or indeed central Leeds. Do you think, though, that there is an issue about how you construct change, and particularly how to construct a transport network that might end up with some bits of the North doing well, but the bits of the North that really need help being where they've always been, at the back of the queue?
I think this is the key thing about Northern Powerhouse Rail that Chris was talking about. And if you look at it through the lens of this is a new railway between Liverpool and Leeds, then if you live in Durham or Consett, then you're going to say, well, how does this actually help me? But of course, by building that, there are many other places along the way, and that's why we'll have to see what's in the Northern Powerhouse Rail plan before we can see what it's going to do there. But to take the example of High Speed 2 Railway, which I think will still happen in some form, you create that for the new intercity links, but the existing West Coast main line is there and is freed up to allow much greater links to Milton Keynes, to Crewe, to many of the other small places that often don't get forgotten on the way. So I think you can do both in this. But I think there is a really crucial identity question. We mentioned the Northeast here. And, you know, there is a North of Tyne Mayoralty at the moment, which to me is completely mad, when there is a clear economic unit in Tyneside that includes Newcastle, Gateshead, Durham, Sunderland, what have you. You could create a conurbation around that. Why does that not exist? Because all the local council leaders were arguing and they wouldn't do a deal with each other. So sometimes problems of these things are founded locally due to local rivals, due to people's feelings about each other. If you don't mind me, Trevor, to come back on a point that was made earlier about business investment, I think that is actually very key here, because yes, you can pour money into transport, yes, you can make up for decades of underinvestment, but to get a sustainable economy in the places that have struggled, you've got to make an appetising business environment. And I think there's obviously the government are looking at free ports, you've got questions about enterprise zones, things you can do to encourage business investment. So when that white paper comes out later this month, that's actually what I'm most interested in, because it's easy to pour money into things, but you can only do that so many times, and that doesn't create a sustainable economic base when you hit the next downturn and public spending eventually gets cut back. And if you look at the example of Liverpool, when it was regenerated in the 1980s and 1990s, that was based on public-private partnerships. And I think that has to be really key to this if you're going to make it not just a one-off hit.
Jackie Freeborn, I think, has raised this point about public-private partnerships and to the extent to which they are important. I wonder if we could come to Jackie in a moment. There you are. We will get a microphone to you now. Jackie.
Oh, hi. Yeah, my question is exactly about that, because I think we've seen some great examples of where public and private have come together to solve problems. But it doesn't work all the time, and I'm just wondering whether we need some sort of institute of enlightened leadership and collaboration so we can learn from those best examples and put it into practice at a local level. Local politics always get in the way, always do, it's just the nature of it is. But businesses and public sector are very different in the way that they make decisions, the way that they have to be accountable. And I'm just wondering, how do we capture the best of that and roll it out to places and make sure it becomes an intricate part of the economy and what we do to actually regenerate places?
Charles, you run a big public sector outfit, a university, and you presumably sit at the centre of a kind of collaboration. How does it work, and does it work actually in Leeds?
That's a very, very good question, and a good question from Jackie. I head a university, Leeds Trinity University. We work with over 3,000 businesses. And we take pride in saying that all our students at the undergraduate program have placement. The only university that will say that all our undergraduates. And we're able to do that because of the collaboration and the cooperation we have with businesses. Just last week, I was in a meeting with the Chambers of Commerce, speaking to businesses, wanting to know how we can co-jointly offer our programs to our students to make sure that these students are undergoing a program so that when they finish, they're as ready as they can with businesses. So partnership, collaboration, I think it's important. And I have to say there are increasing opportunities to do that. Apprenticeship, it's one way. We take pride as a university to have apprenticeship with the West Yorkshire Police and with the prison services, the Unlock program. And we cannot do that without having real partnership. But it's partnership where the two partners will have to get something and put something in that. I don't think we will get real leveling up if we don't partner and making sure that there is trust, honesty, and reciprocity in the way we partner. So it's working if it's put together well.
Simon, do you think that we've got the environment that allows for that kind of partnership? One of the things that businesses say, and they say this all over the country, not just in the north, that, for example, the apprenticeship programme, too difficult, too bureaucratic. And in fact, I think that there are several £100 million worth of grant sitting unused because employers can't be bothered to go through all of the processes and the hoops.
Well, it's interesting, actually. There's a study out from Newcastle College, earlier this year, which stated that now more than ever, there's more places people are looking to work and study locally because they don't want to be in a situation where they're having to be away from home if another situation like the last 18 months arises. And I think the rise in searches for higher level apprenticeship was something to 171% or something like that. So I think that demand proves that there's got to be a simplification. But that's the challenge that happens is those decisions and how it's all made and the route to getting it is made with, by the same people making the same decisions. That's why you need to bring those people who are trying to access this, whether it be the students, whether it be the businesses, got to bring people together. And it comes back to that conversation again about let's bring different people into the mix to ensure that these things thrive. There's no point in having these opportunities out there, then there's a demand for them, 171% people searching for those higher level apprentices, but they can't get to it. So we have to change, we have to fix the system by bringing the right people to discuss what do we need to make it easier for people to crack on and get engaged with them.
Chris, is there a problem here? The government talks a good game about doing all of this kind of thing. And by the way, this is government of all stamps. But to take the example of the apprenticeships, actually one of the things that became clear quite early in the apprenticeship programme is that it worked at high level. So, for example, the showcase example for the apprenticeship programme is Rolls-Royce in Derby. Fantastic. But that's basically degree level. But actually lower down, or at lower levels of qualification, it doesn't seem to work, or the cost in resource and difficulty getting it to happen is so great, it's not worth it for employers.
Well, it's very difficult for many organisations to make the apprenticeship levy work. Corporations can, because basically organisations like Rolls-Royce, other large organisations are basically doing this apprenticeship approach already. All they have to do is configure what they're already doing into a format where they can draw that money back into their organisation. Smaller organisations find it far more difficult. A company in my constituency, Steelworks, they train their people. They've trained their people for decades, and it doesn't work for them. And so therefore, they don't feel it's an apprenticeship levy for reinvestment, they feel it's a tax. And the government has to be far more respectful of organisations at whatever level, and rather than having an ambition, which from the outside, objectively, you just think this is about a large number of apprenticeships, so a minister can say, we have achieved X, Y, or Z. It's got to be far more respectful of different sized organisations. And yes, if we want to encourage large organisations to invest in apprenticeships, that's fine, but we've got to appreciate that they're largely already doing it.
Okay. We've got a question from Bob Jeffrey, who I think represents the Sheffield Trade Council, which, if I have my history right, is one of the kind of fundamental organisations of the trade union movement, producing I think, people like David Blunkett, if I'm not mistaken. Bob?
Second oldest in the country after Aberdeen. So yeah, we at Sheffield TUC, we set up a campaign in 2016 called Sheffield Needs a Pay Rise. This was in response to a Resolution Foundation report that showed the Sheffield City region had the highest proportion of workers on low pay of any city region in the UK. Now, associated with that, we've seen very high levels of underemployment, lots of people in zero-hour contracts. And part of what our campaign is doing is trying to fight to get better work terms and conditions for workers, so that businesses, particularly large businesses, aren't just taking money out of the community while disproportionately employing staff on precarious contracts. Now, while we're coming at that from a trade union angle, there's increasing talk of good work charters in city regions as a mechanism to drive up terms and conditions. And I wondered what the panel thought of those initiatives.
Seb Payne, you probably can't move in Westminster, which is where you normally work, for people going high wage, high skill, low immigration. Let's leave the low immigration for a moment. I want to come to that. What can we do about the low wage problem that Bob's talking about?
Well, this is not something new, we should say, by the way, that this issue about wages and skills we've been trying to fix in this country pretty much ever since the Second World War, and we've tried various schemes of just putting more money in without the productivity gains, and we saw inflation that resulted from that. We've tried various skills and apprenticeships, and I think we are on a much better track now than we have been ever before about that. Look, the Johnson government is having a very good push at this by keeping those migration levels low and hoping that that will naturally result in the labour market increasing wages. And that does seem to be happening. Whether that's happening at a sustainable rate that's going to not result in big economic bubbles in the coming months is yet to be seen there. But I think fundamentally it's that stat you were talking about earlier, Trevor, in terms of the gap of people in the right jobs and the heave between moving between where we were and where we're heading. And I think when you look at the coronavirus pandemic, it has exposed so much of stuff that was already there but below the surface. Many zombie companies that were based on very cheap labour, very low skilled labour and very tight profit margins, they've been wiped out by the pandemic. I don't think anyone fully knows the answer to this, because what we're trying to do in this country, I don't think it's ever been done in such a short space of time so quickly. If Boris Johnson had said, I want to do this in 18 months, you could see a way of going towards that, and it could be a gradual process. Unless they pull back on not allowing more skilled people in through the visas programme, then we're going to try and do this over a very short, quick period of time. And I think we're eventually going to see how the public feels about this, because we can see the disruptions in HGV drivers, in terms of CO2 and food production. They will eventually ease, because the labour market will filter out and they will get higher wages. But the disruption to get there is going to be really quite significant. So it's like a shortcut to try and do something we've been trying to do for decades.
So when we think about in the industrial north and wages and all the rest of it, I think that the image that comes to mind is usually blokes in overalls in places like this, but actually low wages are more characteristically associated with female employment and to some extent public service employment. Can we actually do anything about that without the kinds of consequences that Seb's talking about, which is we throw money at it, inflation rages, and then we go back to square one?
I think we're at a sliding doors moment. I think what we've seen in the last 18 months is flexibility that has never been afforded to particularly those who are in low-paid and also in those caregiving roles as well. The amount of money, it's billions of pounds on the economy, that is that unpaid work economy, but that opportunity that should not. I don't subscribe to build back better. I subscribe to build forward better, because I think it's not about just taking. Or we'll just go back to the way it was. I think it is a sliding doors, and I think we have to take the opportunities around this flexibility, because otherwise we're going to see we're going to revert back to like a 1950s Britain if we're not careful. If we've got organisations going to change the way and go, we can't do that anymore. You've all got to be in the office. We can't do this. We don't know what's around the corner. I think someone I was talking to last week was like, this is the worst time to be making a big decision at the moment because we don't know quite where we are. So I think we have to be careful that we want to go forward better, but we are a sliding doors. We cannot go back to women at home and the low-paid jobs and, you know, going into those sort of very sort of very stereotypical offices. We have to take the opportunities, and this is where the forward-thinking employers and small businesses can set that culture. There's a study by Ernst & Young earlier this year that, you know, half of people would leave their jobs if it wasn't a purpose-led, you know, employer, if they didn't have that opportunity. And I think where flexibility, it was always a wage and salary expectations. Purpose is now more important for those people on that career track.
Chris, the Prime Minister, who's a cheerful sort of bloke, constantly holds out the sunlit uplands, high wage, high skills, all that. But as Seb was saying, it's not a nice straight gradient from here to there, and we might find ourselves in a place where actually what we have is a very tricky labour market, not rising wages. This could be a political catastrophe for the government, couldn't it?
Well, we're in a very difficult situation. The pandemic has had a massive impact, and we can't take that out of the equation. So how do we get our recovery going? The more we impose upon business, and I'm sure this won't be what the gentleman would like to hear, the more we impose upon business, the more challenges they will face in trying to create that business. And if we remove competitive advantage from certain areas, you won't get that business in the first place. And what we need to see is businesses locating in Sheffield, in many northern towns and cities, and build upon that, because it's going to take years for improvements in education, improvements in transport, improvements in other areas of our lives when we're trying to recover and level up. It's going to take a very long time, but we need to get the jobs now, in the coming days, weeks and months. So imposing...
And how does that happen?
How does that happen? With the spending review, I want to see some pretty positive, and with the budget, a pretty positive ambition. I want to see clear details in the white paper for levelling up, setting out exactly what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. And we might be talking about Brexit at some point, but one of the aspects of Brexit is how do we be more flexible in our interpretation and use of laws that impact business. So, for example, the agri-tech business is pretty much dead in Europe. It's booming in America, it's booming in other places. Now that we're outside the European Union, how much can we focus on agri-tech, biotech, other businesses and industries which are coming down the line, which are here already, that we can use a competitive advantage?
Let me ask a couple of questions. You said...
There's something I just wanted to quickly come back on there, if you don't mind, which is that technology is very crucial to all this as well, that many industries, you mentioned agriculture, are going through a great wave of automation. That is going to be key. But I don't think you can rely on that to make up for the gaps within the labour market. You've got to be very careful about this, that technology is coming. You need to be ready and to adapt to it and to get, crucially, those productivity gains you don't automatically get with higher wages. But you can't wholly rely on it.
That, in fact, is exactly the point I wanted to come to. There is a labour market problem, isn't there? That we aren't necessarily... we don't necessarily have the right people with the right skills in the right place. What would you say if one of the things that regions could control, as they do, for example, in Canada, is immigration? Canadian provinces have a certain number of visas which they are allowed to issue to meet their needs. Now, would there be any mileage at all in the north or parts of the north being able to seek out the right talents wherever they happen to be in the world? What do you think, sir?
I think the idea you could allow certain regions to have visa schemes, I think, is one that is definitely worth examining, because if you want to create those clusters of industry where you're attracting talent from across the world and being particularly appetising so everyone doesn't just go into the London southeast bucket, which is what's happened for much skilled migration, I think, over recent decades, that's definitely worth exploring. But of course, as well, you get many practical situations about that in terms of how you implement it, how that feeds into the whole UK's migration policy too. Now, of course, the danger of going down that route is you do end up with a wholly planned economy, which will go and say, this is going to happen here, we're going to have this many people. And I think, you know, we've tried a planned economy in various times over our recent history, and it hasn't always been wholly successful. But I think the crucial point, which you're right, Trevor, is you've got to have the ability for each region to do things differently and to have the powers to do that. So whether it's getting more visas for particular aspects of their labour markets, to having control over taxes, being able to maybe do something around corporation tax or business rates within different areas, because that's the only way you break this cycle that we've had. And I think there was a change made. This is a very technical thing, which is a very important thing. The Treasury has this thing called the Green Book, which defines where government investment goes. And Rishi Sunak ripped up the Green Book and rewrote it last year. That was one of the most important things, because that's become this cyclical thing, which is, where do you want to invest? Where you're going to get the highest rate of return? Where is that? London, the South East. And that's how you've got the situation of the overheated economy within the South. And that's now been redone to put an influence on other aspects, not just your direct financial return of investment. So that's the kind of thing I think you need to look at. But I think definitely visas for particular regions, I think that's something that the mayors should definitely lobby for.
Charles, what do you think? Leeds being able to control its labour market?
I think there's so much to be said around the point Seb has made. One thing is clear: the regions, the cities, the towns, and the businesses in those localities are best able to identify the skills they need. They're also able to identify the matching of skills to jobs, whether it's high skills and low skills. I'd wanted to intervene in the last question about the low skills and the low jobs, and why we are where we are. Very, very complicated and complex. But nonetheless, I think there's something to be said about giving a kind of real autonomy to the regions to decide what they want for their businesses, for the individuals, for the regions and the cities. But I think there's complication around managing the wider concept administratively and logistically around the issue of immigration, and we need to handle that with care.
I agree with empowerment, but I think there's also got to be that cross-regional collaboration as well, because otherwise you're reinventing wheels. So I think it's the power in that coming together.
We've heard mentioned several times in this discussion the levelling up white paper, for which, you know, there are millions sitting waiting, rather like, you know, waiting for the new Harry Potter or whatever it is. I'm going to ask each one of you to tell me something that you really want to see in that white paper. You know, whether it is a number of money, or it is a sentence, or it is a policy. Heseltine saying, you know, have accountable leaders in every place, and that would be the thing that made the difference. So, each one of you, start with you, Chris. If the Prime Minister rang you up and said, Chris, you've got a paragraph and you can write it and nobody can interfere with it, what would it be?
What I would have is a commitment to nuclear energy. We need reliable, cheap energy. The northwest of England has a huge nuclear sector, huge amounts of talent in the northwest of England. So I want to see that, because I believe the north of England and part of levelling, a significant part of our levelling up, ought to be manufacturing, including heavy manufacturing. And therefore, we need reliable energy that doesn't go out every time the wind stops blowing. So nuclear energy, it's good for industry, and it's going to be good for the northwest.
Simone?
Investment in our young people, investment in ensuring that we can trump all form of fear that young people have right now about what their future is, and make they can thrive and grow their career in the north, and seats at the table for female-led businesses, black, Asian, minority-led businesses, and young people when these big decisions are being made, and I can give you the bank details for a bank account for that to be paid into.
Yeah, well, you can find that on the website. Okay, Charles.
Trevor, you'll expect me to say real investment in skills and jobs and in the potential of the young ones. And I think the university sector, the higher education sector, and the further education sector really play a role in trying to build the skilled base that the SMEs and large organizations need. Research and development, there needs to be funding in that. And I think there needs to be funding in the relationship between businesses and the academic sector.
Seb?
I want to see a very clear plan of delivery about how all these changes are going to be made, because it's so easy for politicians to talk about improving life chances, improving town centres, improving infrastructure. But what we are talking about is hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny projects all across the country, which on the whole will level up. And I think essentially you need to see a way to actually do that, because for me, to successfully level up is as big of a challenge to the British state as Brexit. And we know that took a long time and a lot of effort. So I want a clear, detailed plan and accountability, data, metrics. What does success look like?
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes, and I just want to ask just a question of my own. One of the things that I'm very struck by, and Seb's book really, without wanting to plug it, illustrates this rather brilliantly. The big change that's come about has been in what you might call company towns. I started life as a chemist, and they might have sent me to Middlesbrough and so on. But you know, these are towns which are built on a single industry, obviously sometimes in a single company. And to some extent, all of that's been destroyed. And I just want to give each one of you quickly 10 seconds. What do we do about towns which have lost their original purpose? I mean, it's a cultural thing as well. Seb?
When I went to Wakefield, which I think is a very key example of one of those places, which was a mill and mining place, it's found a new cultural identity through art and culture, through the Hepworth Gallery, the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and all different towns, I think, are quite good at doing that. But you've got to have good transport links they can get and link into those nearby other towns and other cities as well, because I think if they're just left on their own without the ability to have links to their nearby region, then they will feel a bit down.
I can only have one. Simone, quickly.
I think it's about learning from other cities, other communities that have built forward better and involved the community in their decision making.
Okay, sorry, Charles, sorry, Chris. But that's it for this discussion, part of our Big Ideas Live on Sky News. In a moment, here in Rotherham, I'll be sitting with my colleagues from Sky News to assess what we've learnt today, Ed Conway, Ian King and Samantha Washington. And you can follow that by going to the stream on Sky's website. But for now, goodbye.